This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Podcast is found everywhere podcasts are found. And if you go to YouTube and put in Spirit Matters Talk, will come up. So you'll be able to not only hear us, but to see us. And for those out there that have contributed to help keep us on the air, we thank you. If anybody would like to be part of that group, just go to spiritmatterstalk.com. And remember, our archives are free and open to the public, close to 300 interviews in there. And if you are either listening or watching, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, and we'd appreciate that. We have back on our show, Dana Sawyer. He is a professor emeritus of philosophy and world religions at the Maine College of Art and author on biographies on both Aldous Huxley and Huston Smith. He is an expert, tremendous background in Hinduism and Buddhism. But today we'll be focusing on another area that he's written and spoken extensively on, and that is the perennial philosophy, and especially what's understood and misunderstood about it. So Dana, thank you so very much for taking the time to come back on the show with us today.
Thank you guys so much for inviting me. Always great to see you.
Great.
Actually, the first time we interviewed, it was just audio. So now we can
That's great.
to each other.
Now people can revel in the visuals as well as the audio. Welcome back, sir. And as Dennis said, we wanted to focus on your expertise on what is known as the perennial philosophy. And I should say, Dana and I have had many conversations about this and many email exchanges. And I just recently read an article he wrote for an academic journal on the subject, clarifying certain misconceptions. So let's begin, Dana, first. It's a two-part question. What got you interested in the perennial philosophy, and what is the perennial philosophy for people? What do we mean by perennialism?
I got interested in the perennial philosophy a gazillion years ago, back in 1969, as an undergrad in college. There was a required philosophy course. I took it my freshman year, and we read Brave New World in that course, and Brave New World Revisited. And it really lit me up like a Christmas tree. I got so excited about the ideas. And the professor said, well, if you like Huxley, you ought to read this. And so I read the Perennial Philosophy, and Huxley was such an amazing writer, it was hard not to be compelled. So that was how I got introduced to it. What is the Perennial Philosophy? Oh, he's got a book right there. All right, great.
It's Dana's book.
A newer edition than
so
I
much
read many years ago.
Yeah, came out in 1945, so it's been around a while. But what is the Perennial Philosophy is, simply a way of understanding and talking about and thinking about and wondering about a particular mystical experience, I don't really like the word mystical or mysticism because it's so loose and baggy. And in our time of snarky cynicism, people tend to want to dismiss that word, or people that think seriously about it. So I prefer noetic, which basically means from noesis, so inner knowing from the inside out. So Huxley was describing a theory about the value of knowing from the inside out.
And
that's what it is. That's what the Perennial Philosophy is an understanding of a particular type of mystical or noetic experience.
And from that experience, I mean, your background in Buddhism, your background in Hinduism, where and how does those philosophies, those religions, those beliefs tie into the perennial philosophy? Is it their basis? I mean, if we simply take it as knowledge coming from within, from what I know of Vedic knowledge of Buddhism, that's what it is based on. But what other parallels, and how do you go more deeply into it? If a student asks, or let's really dig into this, what do they mean by that?
Well, you put your finger on something, Dennis. Buddhism and Hinduism both are religions that place a premium on inner knowing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're mystical religions in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. And there are commonalities. I listened to your excellent interview recently with Robert Thurman, and Bob brought some of those up, that when we're dealing with that noesis, when we're dealing with that inner knowing, and then we're dealing with rational descriptions of that knowledge, you get nuance in the rational descriptions, but there's lots of reason to believe they're talking about similar experience.
So that to me has always been the essence of what we call perennialism. I read Huxley's book probably around the same time you did.
Yeah, me too.
Maybe 670, whatever.
Yeah,
And it had a big impact on me because at that time I had already started meditating, and I was deeply immersed in reading books about Vedanta and Zen and all this stuff. And then when I read Perennial Philosophy, what he does is show that all the spiritual traditions, or what he would have called the mystical branches of those traditions, the sages, the mystics, they all described the same or similar experiences in different languages, despite the culture, despite the religions they come from and all that. And that's what I took away from it, was this universality of the inner experience. Now, so could you comment on that aspect of it, and why people in your business take exception to it?
Yeah, definitely I can. I agree with what you say. One of the problems that can arise is if you start talking about a universal experience, is that people think you're talking about universalism. That's one of the charges against perennial philosophy that doesn't really work. And what I mean by that is there are universalist religions, right? Baha'i is a universalist religion, Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky and all that was a universalist religion. The perennial philosophy is not a form of universalism. You don't, there's nothing to join. There's not a secret club handshake. There's nothing like that. It's simply stating that across the religions, we can identify a common experience. And there's several things that my colleagues in religious studies push back against. First of all, we live in a time where a kind of entrenched materialism exists in the academy, and nobody wants to talk about noetic experience. They want to dismiss it as woo-woo or new age silliness, whatever. So there's one problem, right? Is because knowledge can be gained in a non-rational way, that certainly doesn't mean that it's irrational. And so there's that piece of it. And then the other piece of it is, if we say there's a common experience across the religions, we're not necessarily saying that it's the core of religion or the essence of religion. And that's another false charge against it. Just stick with me here for a minute. First of all, I make the argument in this article for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology that the perennial philosophy is not one unified monolithic silo description of a common noetic experience. It's a family of theories about a common noetic experience. Just like existentialism is a family of theories, or Romanticism was, or German idealism was a family of theories. So you can't pull one particular person who self-identifies as a perennialist out and say, whatever this person says is what they all believe. Again, it's not a church, it's not a dogma, it's a family of theories. And one common mistake is the mistake that all perennialists are arguing that this common mystical experience and, getting down to where the rubber meets the road, that's an experience Huxley called the unitive knowledge. And what he meant by that was an experience of profound sense of merger or union with the sacred, becoming one with it. And Huxley saw this as a common experience across the religion. He didn't make the charge that it was the core or essence of all religion, because he felt the religion should be free to decide for themselves what their essence of, or core was. So a common experience rather than necessarily the essence is one thing.
A couple of questions along these lines, trying to get my head wrapped around it. Does one who accepts the perennial philosophy, is that would that assume that they're also accepting what we would call non-duality? And is there variations on that experience that Huxley describes? And is it an experience that comes and goes, or is it necessarily an experience that must come and stay? So a couple of questions there, but I think these are things that are stirred up when we discuss perennial philosophy.
Well, you'll need to remind me of, you got a little bit of a list there, Dennis.
Yeah, we can go wherever with it. Yeah. Take which one you like. Yeah.
Let's go with the last one first. Huston Smith, who was a close friend and mentor of mine, he said the goal is to turn flashes of insight into an abiding light. Now, at the same time he said that, Huston didn't believe human beings could ever reach what is often called enlightenment or full breakthrough where they become living Buddhas. He believed that the mortal coils, as he called them, were too strong to allow for that. Now, on the other hand, Huxley believed we can break through and make it an abiding light. So here is one of the places where we see that theorists differ about this issue. Now, when it comes to your other question about what do we unite with, and dang, that is a juicy question. Ken Wilber, makes an interesting point when he's a perennialist of a particular stripe, makes the argument that usually when mystics are talking about what they united with or melted into was what he calls the great I, that they felt like they merged with their higher self, the great thou, that they melted into and became one with God, a Teresa of Avila sort of experience, or Meister Eckhart, or what we see in Lurianic Kabbalah, or the great it, which is something closer to what we find in Advaita Vedanta, or we find in most forms of Mahayana Buddhism, Zen, for example, right? That the individual mind became the Buddha mind, but it's not that I met the Buddha, if you see what I'm trying to say. So the great I, the great thou, and the great it. Now, if we say, and this is juicy, that, there's neurological evidence that subjects who claim to be having these experiences, however they describe or label it, seem to be producing the same neurophysiological signature. Now, they're preliminary studies, Andrew Newberg, et cetera, but that's a really interesting and juicy place to consider, right? What the future will hold in that regard.
Dana, mutual friends of ours who was an academic and made a great contribution to the field, the study of mystical experience. I remember him arguing that the term perennial philosophy throws people off because we think of philosophy as an activity of
Right.
rational thought and logic and speculative cogitation. So he favored the term perennial psychology, because we're talking about an experience, something experienced within. How do you feel about that? Does that become an issue, calling it a philosophy?
Well, two things to say there. First of all, you raised the point I've been making, which is there are people that identify as psychological perennialists. So they say, oh, we see a common experience psychologically across cultures and individuals, but they're not trying to make any ontological claims about the nature of reality. And Francis Vaughan comes to mind, you know, the great psychologist. So I applaud that, and it makes the point that it's not a siloed perspective, but a family of theories. What was the first part of your question?
The term philosophy.
Yes, okay. And you will remember that in the perennial philosophy, in the very beginning, Huxley points out that it's not a philosophy in the usual sense. I would remind also that philosophy literally means, you know, a lover of wisdom, a lover of wisdom. And perennialists are lovers of wisdom, and they're making the argument that there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge, and inner knowing brings great wisdom. Mm-hmm. So you're right, it's not a systematic philosophy, or I should say, several people have tried to give it a systematic explanation, but it doesn't hinge on those explanations. It hinges on this, you know, a lot of current studies going on with psychedelics now are using a typology created by Stace and Pankey and Richards, in which they're trying to identify the UME, I mean the unitive mystical experience. Okay, the unitive mystical experience, the UME. So it hinges on that. And I'm going to get back to something Dennis asked, which is, do all theorists see it as non-dual? And what's interesting is the answer to that, as far as I'm aware, and I think I'm fairly aware, is yes. Most do say, maybe because it's a unitive mystical experience, that it transcends all duality. So there we see a place where it wouldn't be, at least theories of the experience wouldn't be in agreement with Sankhya philosophy and Hinduism, for example, that is a dualistic system. Right. Or most iterations of Theravada Buddhism, which are also dualistic.
Did Huxley recommend a procedure or methodology for having that mystical experience?
That's also a really good question. One thing to say there is that when we look at the different theorists, they have very different theories about what the best method is. For example, there's one whole school of perennialists that call themselves the traditionalists. And Huston Smith was for a time a member of that group. And they believe the traditional religions and the traditional mystical traditions inside the religious traditions, Sufism inside the Islam, for example, Kabbalah inside of Judaism, are the tried and true pathways up the mountain of spirit. Why bushwhack your way up when there are already established paths? That's the way they see it. Now, on the other hand, Huxley was much more of a pragmatist in the sense that one size doesn't fit all. Whatever works, works. And so he was one of the people that helped instigate the Esalen Institute in California. He was invited there and basically debriefed by Mike Murphy and Price. And he said, let's run experiments. Let's start experimenting with lots of methods and see what sticks to the wall and what can work. For Huxley himself, he was a close friend of Krishnamurti. Okay. And Krishnamurti's approach was just wake the hell up. You know.
Snap out of it.
Yeah, you know, I recently read a novel where somebody described us all as high-functioning sleepwalkers. In a paper, I once described us as wind-up toys made out of meat. So, you know, Krishnamurti was saying, so shake off all that scale, all that rust,
Yeah.
and wake up to your true nature. And so, you know, I don't know how it, you know, worked out for Huxley. But that was the approach he took in the last probably 15 years of his life.
So a while ago, I remember having conversations with you because some prominent people in your field took a public issue with perennialism and pointed out the obvious, that all religions are not the same. And these people like Huxley and Huston Smith and Joseph Campbell, they're saying, you know, they're all the same. They're not all the same. This perennialism is bunk. And I kept thinking, God, are they missing the point?
Right.
So
I'm laughing because who the hell doesn't know that?
yes,
Right,
and
right.
you know, I know Houston was still alive at the time, and he was incensed that people would think that of the, you know, the guy who wrote the book on comparative religion. But explain what that attempted, you know, takedown of perennialism is all about, and what the counter is.
Well, I am assuming you're bringing up the debate between Stephen Katz and Huston Smith. Stephen Katz, excuse me, way back in 1978, wrote an essay that got taken in as received knowledge in academia. And there are still academics who will harp on it or not harp on it in the sense that because they accepted it as a dogma all those years ago, they stopped thinking about it or wondering about it. And as very good arguments have come out against Katz's perspective, your friend Robert Foreman,
Bob Foreman, yeah,
wrote some excellent critiques of the perspective. They haven't looked at those. They've ignored them. But basically, the argument was that mystics do not all have the same experience because they grew up in different cultures speaking different languages, and cultural and neuro-linguistic programming are so powerful that all human experience is mediated or colored by that programming. And so Jews have Jewish mystical experiences, Christians have Christian mystical experiences, Hindus have Hindu mystical experiences, and there's no way for us to get free of that programming into anything like a pure consciousness state, unmediated awareness kind of state. So that was the argument, and therefore mystics in different traditions couldn't be having the same experience.
if they have an experience at all, because some of them think that they're just imagining, you know, certain things.
Exactly.
I'm wondering what's next for you. Do you have a book?
Dennis,
go
if I
ahead.
can, I want to let Dana refute that position.
Okay.
Well, a quick refutation is if we say that Hindus look at the moon on moonlit nights and Christians look at the moon on moonlit nights, because they live in different cultures, does that mean there's actually no moon? I mean, they may have slightly different interpretations of what they're experiencing, but to say nothing is there that's shared is, to my mind, silly. I mean, anybody can read the complex arguments against that position. They're out there.
Is there a rebuttal when you say that to them?
From them?
Yeah.
Not really. They want, you know, I have to say.
I can't think of a rebuttal. That's why I'm asking you.
Well, they want to go to this place of pure consciousness. They want to definitely pick at that like a scab, like, oh, I don't think there's such a thing as pure consciousness that isn't colored at all. You see what I mean? But what I argue in my article is that the perennial philosophy doesn't depend upon the existence of a pure consciousness state. What it depends upon is an experience of unity with the sacred, however it's interpreted, however it's colored.
Two things that, Dana, I'd like you to comment on. One, we mentioned Bob Foreman. One of the things he argued with Katz about was that people who experience pure consciousness,
yes,
for whom that's an inner reality, and because they've been doing sadhana for however number of years, or they slip into it, it's not an arguable point. It's just an experience that's self-evident, and he had to make that argument in academic terms. The other thing is Huston Smith's distinction between esoteric and exoteric, which I find very useful in this regard. And I'm happy to say when he wrote the intro to American Veda, he mentions that. So maybe you could elaborate on those things.
Okay, well, first of all, you're exactly right that if you've been to Paris, then if you come back here and somebody tells you Paris doesn't exist, that's very hard to swallow. You've been up in the Eiffel Tower, you've eaten some great cheese. It's silly, frankly, I think, ultimately. But when we get down, let's go to your second part of that, Huston's categories. In Forgotten Truth, which I read in 1976, and it blew my mind. In fact, I was in grad school at the University of Hawaii at that time, and I met Huston. He came and gave a lecture, and I was like a 14-year-old girl meeting Justin Bieber. That book had such an effect on me. He says in that book that religion functions on two levels. One he called the exoteric level, the exterior level of its beliefs, its rituals, its ceremonies, its buildings, its architecture, its art, its music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also an esoteric level of religion. And that's where the mystics are functioning, an inner level of religion. If we look at religion on the exterior level, then we find difference, tremendous difference. And these are cultural differences, linguistic differences, et cetera, et cetera. But when we look at the writings of the mystics, we start to find something much closer to parity. And
interesting.
again, so that's what who was it? Flannery O'Connor, I think, who said, all that rises must converge. And that was, that was one of the analogies Huston would use, or explanations, metaphors. But he used to say to me, Dana, religion is like pants. It's plural at the bottom, but up at the top, it's singular. And he once said, and at my age, and he was about 92 when he was saying this, he said, I only want to talk about the waistband.
That's great. One last question, Dana, from me, and that is, do you have a book you're currently working on, or one in your mind you're thinking of getting out at some point?
Well, Phil brought it up, which is that I definitely want to write a description of the perennial philosophy, an intro to the perennial philosophy for the popular press that not only disentangles illusions about what it is, but explains it in everyday language, pulls it out of academia, gets it down on the street. Phil's a better writer than me, so maybe he should be writing this book.
I'll advise you, Dana. But I do talk about this a lot, and I allude to it in my own work, but I certainly wouldn't take it on an academic level. But that raises a question, which is the issue of evidence. What is the evidence for perennialism, other than looking at like Huxley did, looking at the writings of great mystics in all the different traditions and showing through excerpting passages that they're saying essentially the same thing. Is there evidence that we can now, using the instruments of modern science, using journalistic inquiry, any of that can support the position?
Well, Phil, that's a brilliant question because it brings up some really wonderful things. First of all, for when Huxley was writing, he was comparing textual evidence for mystics that had died in various countries centuries earlier. But now, partially because of what you and I and Dennis lived through, the 1960s, that we all got interested in all these mystical, esoteric, noetic traditions and practiced them. So you have practitioners in their 70s now, late 60s, all the way through their 70s, who've been practicing various techniques for 50 years in some cases. And so neurologically, you can study the profile of the output, brain output, and compare those. So there's one thing that's going on today that suggests perennialism may hold water. And then you can also study mystical experience in real time using psychedelics. You know, we're in the middle of what people are referring to as a psychedelic renaissance. So much therapeutic value has been clinically proven to exist coming out of this research at Johns Hopkins, at NYU, at Columbia, at Yale. I gotta say, it makes me laugh to think of people at Yale doing psychedelics. I always thought of that as a very conservative place. But now there's a chance to study noetic insight in real time, not just comparing, doing textual, comparative textual research. So that's very exciting, very juicy. And a lot coming out of it. There's a religious studies, there's a study going on at Johns Hopkins right now with 34 religious leaders from various traditions, rabbis, priests, ministers, Buddhists, and comparing their experiences under psilocybin. Wow. So what will come out of that? I mean, I think the next 10 years are going to be very exciting in that regard.
I've had, and I want to just get your take on this. I've had a kind of informal, non-rigorous experiences with this. And someone, I can't remember who, but came up with this
you mean you just
exercise to do. What's that?
You mean you just took acid at a great
No, I'm not.
That's what I thought you
This is the non-chemical version.
Oh,
non-chemical of in sort of interfaith or gatherings of people from different spiritual traditions, having them describe what they consider their most sacred or the most deepest spiritual experiences, but without using religious jargon.
Right.
So you can't say, you know, God came to me or I saw Jesus. You have, you know, what were you feeling? What was the inner perception like? And when people do that, they end up describing some things, you know, there's variety, but the variety is very similar. Coming, you know, with, oh yes, I experienced unconditional love. I experienced vast awareness or whatever. Consciousness without an object.
Yes, exactly. In fact, you know, you and I have taught together several times at Kripalu, etc. And often I'll ask an audience, have you ever had a mystical experience? And a lot of times you'll get, no, not really, I don't think so. And I'll say, have you ever had a touchstone experience you keep coming to that informs your life? And they'll say, oh yeah. And then I'll ask them to describe it. And, you know, a lot of times they'll say, well, why aren't you thinking of that as a mystical experience? It sounds mystical to me. You know, I think people don't realize And it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we're human beings.
Right.
Huxley called us multiple amphibians. We live in physical worlds, we live in mental worlds, we live in emotional worlds, and we live in, for lack of a better word, euphemistically, spiritual worlds. So humans are constantly, bleeding over into these experiences that
Yeah.
I would call mystical, as it seems you would too.
And then there's the unfortunate connotations that the word mystical has.
Right.
Exactly.
Whereas if I've spoken to parents who talk about this sort of transcendent, luminous experience of being with their child, or a childbirth, or people going hiking in the woods and they have these experiences. Those are mystical experiences, but
Right.
they don't think of them that way.
Right. And in Judaic Christian tradition, at least in the Western world now, even if they accept those experiences, they don't embrace them as part of human experience, as a common experience, as a commonality that people should be aspiring toward. They'll talk about emotional experience you should have. You should feel love. You should feel compassion. You should have good thoughts, powerful thoughts, this and all. But when it comes to mystical experience, I haven't often heard it said in those traditions at this time that you should embrace and you should work toward having those mystical experiences. So it's and maybe, I mean, some are, but I think you don't hear of that much.
Yeah, and we co-create our cultural consensus trance.
Mhm.
And part of what goes on in our culture is when somebody goes, hey, I had this thing happen to me the other day. We tend to say, oh, that's funny, that's weird. Hey, how about those Celtics? We tend to dismiss those things or just put them in the, oh, that's odd, that's funny.
Right.
But if you actually counted them all up, it's amazing
Right.
how often these things happen.
Dana, one last question. To what extent, in your experience and in the research, do these kind of inner noetic experiences lead to transformations in person's life? What Huston would have called altered traits as opposed to altered states.
Mhm.
Well, like you say, Huston made the argument that the traits matter more than the states, that if they're just flashy experiences, who cares? It's a form of entertainment. But if after these experiences, and this was true of the traditional mystics, your life has changed, you start finding your behavior moving in the direction of gratitude, compassion, kindness, etc. Now we're talking about something valuable. So the traits matter so much more.
Any last thoughts to share before we have to leave?
Just that, the people that are tuning into your program already know that there's more to them than they thought. So keep pulling that curtain away, right? Keep waking up, keep listening to this program and hearing the thoughts of elders moving along this path of awakening that the world can really use in these days of trouble and consternation. We can use insight, can we not?
Well put. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Dana.
Being with you guys. My pleasure.
Always great to see you. Thanks. We'll have you back when your book comes out.
Sounds great.
Hit that subscribe button. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. See you next time.
Phil, Dana Sawyer back on the show. Always has a lot to say. Very interesting guy, very professorial, very clear, articulate. And the subject of the perennial philosophy really touches upon everything or everyone that we interview in the area of contemporary spirituality.
Yeah, kind of.
You asked them about the definition of the perennial philosophy. Reflect on that. What does Huxley say?
Well, what you just said is also interesting because we tend to interview people who recognize spiritual experience as an important thing. We're not talking about
right,
mainstream faith-oriented religion so much, and so in a sense, our collection of interviews is like an illustration of the perennial philosophy, because everybody's talking about spiritual development from their own perspective, most of them anyway. But let me read you the section from Huxley's book, Perennial Philosophy, that I quoted in American Veda. Huxley describes the perennial philosophy as, quote, the metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with divine reality, the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. And then, his book just brings in evidence from all the traditions of the mystical or esoteric branches of the traditions where people who have had deep experiences have written about them.
Right.
And it shows that regardless of the culture or the era or the, religious history, when they describe their experience, they're very similar, if not identical. And that's
it's interesting. What he said, that one of the criticisms of the perennial philosophy is that different people from different religions will say we're not all the same. But for me. I mean, I was in college. I'm studying comparative religion, and I started TM. I started meditating, and then all of a sudden, I noticed I had exposure to Eastern thought, and I started noticing, well, I see that it's actually a lot of that in Catholicism. There's a lot of that when I was studying Judaism. There's a lot of that in every branch of every religion, the Quakers, the this, that. So if there's a commonality like that, the people in it can deny it, but I'm looking at it's like if you go to 8 different cities and the people in those cities said, don't compare us, we're all the same. But actually, I find certain similarities in large urban areas. And, it's okay for me to bring them out, even if one's Bangkok and one's Shanghai and one's Moscow and one's Paris and New York, there's similarities, and that's what I want to focus on. And so it's interesting, though, but that there's that criticism amongst the.
Well, it's weird because nothing could be more obvious than that religions are different from one another. They make different claims. They have different views of history. They have different belief systems.
Different outfits.
Different outfits, different music, different
Right.
Rituals. They're different. And, for people to criticize thinkers on this of the stature of Huxley and Joseph Campbell and Huston Smith, the best known perennialists, as if they don't know that every religion is, different from one another, but they're pointing out that they're not concerned with those things. The perennial philosophy is concerned with the inner experience that people have. And you just wonder sometimes whether some of these scholars who argue with it just have never had spiritual experience.
And I think the people that are it's most apparent to are like I had a discussion the other day with a Trappist monk, so a Catholic monk that's devoted his life to inner development. He studied with Thomas Keating and others in that tradition. And when he reads Buddhism, when he reads Vedanta, when he reads the philosophies of different groups, the Zoroastrians, whatever, he all of a sudden sees the similarity because his focus in his particular faith or religion is on that essence, on that perennial philosophy.
That's right.
And so for him, it's apparent it exists elsewhere. I think for somebody that's more involved in the superficiality of a particular group, okay, I'm the guy or I'm the gal that produces the wardrobes for the different ceremonies. Our wardrobes are drastically rather different than those of than that other group, that other religion. Okay, that's we agree with that. That's apparent. But if you go a little deeper, it seems apparent to those people that explore in that area, that there's a great similarity. And I think that, obviously what Huxley brought out, that's what our guest brought out today.
Yes, and also, we've had people on the show talk about Thomas Merton.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Merton was, comparing notes with Buddhists and Hindus and Swamis and Taoists and, Sufis, because they had these, they recognize that the inner life brings you, into contact with something that doesn't have boundaries. And,
Right.
and if you get the mystics together, you get the practitioners together, it's like in India, there's a lot of different philosophies under what we think of as Hinduism. But if you get a bunch of yogis together, it doesn't matter which lineage they're from, they're going to be having the same unitive experience,
Right.
inside. And they all know that. That's why, if you look on the surface of belief systems and we believe this is true and you believe that's true, that's where religious wars happen. You get the mystics together and it's just a love fest. No one cares about anything.
Right. I have a question for you, Phil. You would know more about this. When you, if you've been to a conference, say on non-duality, do the non-dual, those people that are expert or promoting that view of non-duality, do they see Huxley as one of them?
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't know. They probably would if they knew of Huxley and they read, his works and all that. Dana would know better than I, because he goes to conferences devoted to Huxley. But, and perennialists, as he pointed out, and I didn't realize the extent of it, they'll have disagreements too.
Right.
About certain nuances, and how to frame it and this and that. If you go to, a non-duality conference, if, to the extent they exist, different non-dualists will, have just points of disagreement about nuance. But when it comes to the experience, the deep experience of the truth, the self, and its union with all that it is, those core principles of yoga and Buddhism, that it's hard to deny that there's a unifying a factor in the direct experience. And Dana, that's what he points out. I read this paper he wrote, taking on some of the misconceptions about perennialism. And he lays it out really good. I wish I had the reference in front of me, but it's in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology sometime in the last 2, 3, 4 months. So you could probably Google it if it's available.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention was, I think it was, he said Huxley spent a lot of time with Krishnamurti. Is that right?
Yeah,
Huxley or Huston Smith. Yeah, or Huxley. Okay, I remember when I was studying with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that is, he was asked about Krishnamurti, because Krishnamurti, like Dana described it beautifully. He said, like, why don't you just wake up, get rid of this stuff? And I think what the response Maharishi had on that was that he was a person that just went into enlightenment, or went into that state, that elevated state, just popped in or whatever, went in one day. So for him, hey, why doesn't everybody do that? But so there wasn't a tradition, there wasn't a path that he rigorously followed, at least in this life, that brought him there. But so he popped in like that. So I think that it was an interesting observation, and Krishnamurti had huge influence.
Yeah, and what was interesting when I researched him for American Veda, he was really against gurus and religion and organizations and methods. He talked about meditation as just silence your mind. And when the gurus like Maharishi and the others got more and more famous, he was denouncing them. Oh, they're charging money and they're teaching these things. Just, you don't have to do that. Be independent. You be self-sufficient on your own. And the more he did that, the more people start treating him like a guru,
Right.
even though he's
Yeah, I mean, I think most people think, and maybe wrongfully so, of Krishnamurti as a guru, as a teacher, as a.
but he would hate that label. But he would say, just quiet your mind.
Mhm.
And people would try to do it and they find it hard. And then they'd go learn TM or go to, Yogananda's method
Right.
or whatever it was, because they needed,
Right.
techniques and methods. So that's what
Yeah.
happened.
Anybody highly skilled in any particular area will just, pick it up and, whatever, it's easy. Just do it, it's in any event. So second time we've had Dana on. I'm going to guess there'll be a third time. A lot to discuss, really very enjoyable.
Always
and again,
always great to have old friends on.
Yeah, we go back. I mean, I'm sure I met him years ago. We have a lot of mutual friends.
Yeah.
And our friend Charlie Donahue out there mails out a lot of philosophical stuff. And I think both of us and Dana are all on the same mailing list. And I get to read these conversations that are generally incomprehensible, but thought-provoking and fun. So just another reminder, we're really getting up into subscriptions. So if you're watching or if you're listening, hit this subscribe button. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. Go into our archives. As we have said before, and Phil has so beautifully put, it's an education. Forget about you don't have to go to graduate school to get a degree in comparative religion or spirituality, spiritual teachings.
It should be a required course.
We have it all there. What's that?
It should be a required course.
It should be for everyone. It should be the perennial course. Now, for those that have helped keep us afloat by making contributions to Spirit Matters Talk, and you can find out about that at spiritmatterstalk.com. I want to remind you, we're not a nonprofit. It's not a donation, but it's a contribution. The contributions have somewhat dried up recently. So if anybody is out there and would like to help us, we want to keep it free and open, and we want to keep it going. Phil and I have been at this, it's 5-6 years or whatever, quite a while, a lot of fun. Great guests, and many more lined up. And so, yes, any help in that area would be greatly appreciated. And any ideas or thoughts for guests we might have, we are open, and we will go through it with our committee and try to get as many on as possible if there's any relevance to contemporary spirituality. So,
all right. Well said, Dennis.
Till next time.
Man, see you next time.
Yeah, next time.